In any packaging design, you're definitely going to be working with typography, and you're also more likely than not going to be working with some type of imagery. So before I give you your first creative packaging assignment, I want to give you an exercise or an assignment working with type, and I'm also going to give you one working with imagery. So talking about type in packaging design, what is the purpose of the typography? You need to communicate the marketing message on a three-dimensional medium. It needs to be viewed from a distance. If you think of any store situation, you're usually about 3 or 4 feet away from a product before you take notice of it. It's got to be viewed by people of varying cultural, social, and ethnic backgrounds. And most importantly, you have a very short time to get your message across. So your typography can also help you position your brand. A good illustration of that, if you ever go down the aisle of a supermarket where all the cereal is, you can pretty much tell by the typography if a cereal is really aimed at kids or if it's aimed more at adults or if it's more of a healthy choice. So the typography can really help you differentiate your brand. For any product, you're going to have multiple competitors. So the typography is something you can use to set yourself apart from all your competition. It can help define your product. I put this up here too. I was always kind of pleasantly surprised by the typography that McDonald's uses. It's actually pretty sophisticated, which you wouldn't expect from a fast food brand. But the way they use the typography on their bags, on their cups, on all the various materials that you run into when you're in a McDonald's, actually helps set the attitude. They've tried in recent years to try and go a little bit more upscale with their message, and I think the typography really helps with it. Remember, too, you need to grab your customer's attention. You're going to have a lot of competitors, and again, as I mentioned, in most situations, you've got to do it from at least 3 or 4 feet away. So if it's on the shelf or in the freezer or something that's going to grab someone's attention, make them want to get closer, check it out, pick it up, maybe see the other information on there. The type you choose is also going to affect your customer preference. So choosing bad typography can really affect the sales of your product. And when you're doing typography in packaging design, you definitely have to think in terms of a hierarchy of information. I thought this example was really straightforward. With the kettle chips, you can see at the top, the name, the logo of the company is the biggest. It's most important. That would be the number one concern on there. Then the secondary copy, you can see it's below it. It's a little smaller. Tells you more in depth what the product is, in this case, the flavor. And then thirdly, it's usually some additional information. It can be what we refer to as romance copy, something that's more of a sales pitch. In this case, absolutely nothing artificial. So that usually all falls on what we call the primary display panel. So with most packaging, you're dealing with a three-dimensional format, but there is going to be one side of your product that's going to be primarily facing your consumer. And that's where you need to communicate the marketing or the brand strategy, prevent the information in that hierarchy like I just showed you. Suggest a function, usage, and purpose. So most products we know how to use, but if it's a new product, you might have to actually show people how to use it. Differentiate yourself from your competition. Represent it appropriately and competitively, and also reflect the value perception of quality. And we'll talk more about that as well when we talk about more aspirational packaging design. So type considerations, it has to be legible. It also has to be readable. Those are two different things. Legibility just means you can make out what it is, but readability means it has to make sense. The time it takes you to read it. Remember, in a store situation, someone going up and down the aisles, you don't have a lot of time to catch their attention. And then playing with the size, the shape, and the style of the type you use. Remember, again, in packaging, it has to be legible from a few feet away. It also has to be intelligible to a diverse audience, especially here in Southern California. We deal with a lot of different communities, and you want to make sure that it communicates across all those different communities. You also want to provide a credible description of your product. So when we talk about that hierarchy, here on that prime panel, that is a good example of it. Primary type applications. First up, you have the brand identity, the brand or product name. In this case, it would be Global Organics here. Secondary copy. Here you can see it says organic, so to separate yourself from some of your competitors perhaps. Product descriptor. It's telling you what this is. Baked beans and tomato sauce, which actually sounds horrible, but I thought this was a good example of it. Then we have what's referred to as romance copy. So this is really kind of your sales pitch. So here you can see rich and creamy, these delicious little powerhouses are packed with nutrients, blah, 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 blah. Finally, you have mandatory copy. In the case of anything that's consumable, you're going to have this government nutrition facts, which is usually somewhere on the back where legally you have to spell out the number of calories and the way the nutrition breaks down in here. You may have some legal information that has to go on there. You also may have directions and other web information, contact information may be on there as well. So that primary information you need to convey is what your product is in the brand name, in this case, pizza crust mix. Then you have the secondary information. This could be talking about the flavor of the product, the advertising slogan, the quantity. Really, that's kind of secondary to the brand. The tertiary information, or this is kind of the mandatory information. So you may have instructions on how to prepare the food or the ingredients in there. There may be cautions on how not to use the product or company contact information. Choosing the correct typeface for your brand is going to be key, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about different styles of type. Different classifications of type, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but as you start working with typography, especially with packaging or type for packaging, there are kind of two main classifications. One is what we call display type. This tends to be the more decorative, the more kind of complicated, maybe it's more vintage or retro, more stylistic type. So you can see that kind of here in the word special and buckwheat on this labeling design. So that's display type. Then we have the text or body copy. This is usually serif or sans serif type. It's usually not as decorative as the display type. This is where you would use for a lot of your secondary or tertiary information on here. The three big classifications of type that we'll break stuff down into comes down here into serif type, which is the type that has, you can see the little feet on here. Those are the serifs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then we have what's called sans serif type. So this type, you can see it doesn't have the little feet. So sans or sans means without, and so without serif means without the little feet on it. And then we have script type, which breaks down into a couple of different categories. So serif type, this is the type that has the feet on it, for lack of a better word on here. This is some of the oldest typefaces that we use. They date back to ancient Rome. And one of the theories on why this type has the feet really ties into back in ancient Rome, when type would be when inscriptions were being chiseled onto architecture or monuments. As they were doing these straight chiseled strokes, the verticals and the diagonal strokes here, when they finished the stroke, it left a really rough edge on the top and bottoms. So say you were chiseling the vertical on this M over here, and it'd be very rough at the top or the bottom. So the theory is that the stonemasons would just take their chisel, rotate it 90 degrees, and just do a very kind of clean horizontal finish to the stroke on the top or the bottom. So again, serif fonts are still very popular today. They've been around for thousands of years at this point now. And we'll talk about when you may want to use a serif font. So here's an example of a modern version of a serif font used in packaging design. Now serifs, one of the other characteristics on here is there's a definite difference in the thickness and thinness of some of the strokes on the letters. So you can really see it on the S in the word serif. Now within that serif classification, there's different categories. And really the easiest way to spot these is to look at the capital O's in the font. So in what we call old style serif fonts. First of all, there is a difference in the thickness and thinness of the parts of the letter forms or the strokes, but it's not that pronounced. It's a little thinner or a little thicker. Then if you look at that capital O, if you were to draw a line through the thinnest parts of the O in old style serif fonts, it falls at an axis, kind of like the axis of the Earth itself. So you can see it's a little kind of at an angle there. Then I'll jump ahead here. When you get to modern serif fonts and you look at that O and you draw that line between the thinnest parts of the O, you can see it's totally vertical. So that's a mark of a modern serif font. Also with modern serif fonts, there's a much more pronounced difference in the thickness and thinness of the strokes. So if you look at the M in the word modern, you can see the difference between the thin strokes and the thicker ones is quite pronounced. In between the two, you have what's considered a transitional serif font. So you can see if you draw that line through the O, it's not as much as an angle as the old style, but it's not vertical like the modern fonts. And then finally, we have what are referred to as Egyptian fonts, or more frequently in modern reference, we refer to them as slab serif fonts. And that, if you look at the serif on there, it's equal thickness to the rest of the stroke. It's almost very boxy, which is why we call them slab serif. Why were they called Egyptians? Well, these became very popular in the 1920s and 30s. And that was around the time that King Tut's tomb had been discovered. So there was a craze for all things Egyptian. And these type of fonts reminded people of Egyptian cartouches, which is a type of graphic where you have an oval that has a little blocky foot on it. So that's serif fonts. Here's an example of a modern font called Dido. And so you can see it in different weights here. You can also see the italic version of it, which is actually a nice alternative if you want. If you're thinking of using a script font, but you don't want to go too far, a italic serif font can be a nice middle of the road choice on there. Here's some examples of packaging using serif fonts. And the other thing too, you can use serif fonts just in the lowercase. So I thought this was a nice packaging labeling. People always tend to think you need to use it all in capital letters, or what we call sentence case, where you have a capital beginning letter. But no, you can use it in all lowercase as well. Then we have these sans serif fonts. And again, that means without serifs. So instead of just missing the feet on here, you'll also notice there's not a huge difference. There's still a little bit of a thickness and thinness difference as you go through the letter forms, but it's pretty slight. And what you'll notice as you start working with sans serif fonts, a lot of them in the name you'll see they're referred to as grotesques. And the reason for that is sans serif fonts came about in the early 1800s, primarily used in advertising, and at the time they were considered kind of vulgar. They weren't considered the type of font you would use in polite company. And they were referred to among people of more refined means as being kind of grotesque type. And the name stuck, and you will still see, when you go through your list of fonts, you will still see a lot of sans serif fonts labeled as grotesques. So News Gothic is a grotesque sans serif font. There you can see different weights in it. You can also see with the words is and a, there is an italic version of it, but it's not that pronounced in there. Here's some examples of packaging using more sans serif fonts. And we'll talk about when you may choose to use that as opposed to a serif font. So again, more examples of using sans serif font as opposed to serif fonts. And then we have script fonts. So script fonts, it's hard to imagine because no one actually writes like this anymore, but script fonts were originally developed to mimic handwriting. And they tend to break down into two categories. Very formal scripts like you see here. For lack of a better description, kind of the type of script you would see on a wedding invitation. And here you can see some more examples of kind of more formal scripts. But off to the right with the word bungalow and static down there, you can see a more casual type of script, which we refer to as brush script, or something that really looks a little bit more like handwriting and not quite as formal as the font you see there in Serendipity. So Snell Roundhand is a formal script typeface. There you can see it in various weights. And here's some examples of packaging design using more of that casual brush script. So here you can see a version of it too. And these casual scripts really came about around early mid 20th century, especially it kind of comes out of the world of sign painting. And so we'll talk about these fonts too. There's a very kind of vintage retro feel to them, which is very much in trend these days. And we'll talk more about that. I'm going to break this lecture up in two so you don't have to listen to this too long, so I'll continue this in the next video.